I'd like to welcome everybody this morning to the 2018 TOWA Conference. Good morning, Kent. One of the things I want to do before we introduce our keynote is tell you a little bit about our last 18 months or so of what TOWA's accomplished. I'm very proud of what our board's activities have done over the last 18 months. These are just some bullet points of the things that we've accomplished, and we'll cover some of these things before we go any further. We had a legislative day that we haven't had in many years, and we were basically just went up to reintroduce ourselves to the current legislations, and it turned into a lot more than that. And a big push for that was Wiley Cloud, who's our president-elect right now. And he made some inroads with Representative Lyle Larson. Lyle Larson hosted our meet and greet. We got to meet a lot of young people, staffers, and there was some things brought up about the $10 permit fee that wasn't being applied to on-site wastewater research. And of course, these young, aggressive staffers took that and run with it. And so a bill was created through this networking with these staffers and the legislatures. And these two honorable statesmen, Representative Dade Phelan, Senator Robert Nichols, took that bill through the House and the Senate, and it landed on the governor's desk, and that bill passed. So just without any really legislative effort other than us going up there, we really got a lot accomplished with minimal effort. But there's a lot more to do, and we want to let you know that we're going to continue to do that. What that bill did was create an advisory panel to put that grant money into research topics that affect your livelihoods and the future of Texas. One of the advisory members is Mr. Randy Weber, who's served on our board for many years in almost every facet. We've got Patrick Kern, who is serving on the board presently, and he's both of these gentlemen are just perfect to be providing that insight and information to the TCQ and get research projects started. We got 3 scholarship winners that we awarded monies to last year. Emily Prius is granddaughter of B and Ira Stewart. Bob, okay, don't give me a hard time now. Yeah, Ira, Johnny, we're going to call him Ira. But Zachary James Lessiker and James Matthew Robertson. Many of you might recognize the Lessiker name. That's Dr. Lessiker, one of our members, long-standing members, again, served on the board, and his son is following in the footsteps of becoming an engineer. James Matthew Robertson is looking to be into the EMS, fire rescue. His father is a inspector here in Texas, and so we were just very proud to give these scholarship awards to these recipients. You can find out more about it. It's in your program about what the students are looking to do and their futures. This would not have been made possible without members like you and sponsors. Another thing we did this summer was the TAMU summer program for students. I was able to go and present the history of on-site wastewater to these students as they learn more about it from Professor Munster and others there at the TAMU program. And then they went out into the field with Sissy Bob and got to look at units in the field. They've got to go do a lot of research. You're going to hear more about that from these students. There's going to be a presentation here today or tomorrow on that. Another thing that we did, we had a historic meeting with TCQ commissioners, Brian Shaw, John Neerman, and Toby Baker. In TOWA's history, we have never met with the commissioners. And that wasn't by accident. Your association's moving forward to build those connections from the top down. We started at the legislature, we moved to the TCQ, and we're working through the staff. We also had meetings with Christy Mills-Jurek, James McCain, Mike Price, all very fruitful meetings. Just a few things before we get started. Please make sure your cell phones are on silent or vibrate. If you stand near the doors at the back like you're doing right now, that RFID badge can and will be reading in and off, so you need to get away from the doors. And that's, you know, just to make sure that you get your hours properly. You either come in or go out, and make sure the doors close behind you. We have several door prizes like we did last year that we started up, and you just have to be present to win. And so we've got some good things out there. We've got a scholarship raffle tickets, as you might have seen by the registration desk. After this morning, that'll move to the TOWA booth, but we appreciate anything that you can do for that scholarship program. And that's it. And I'm going to introduce our keynote. As we move along, I have the privilege of introducing this gentleman. He's spoken nationally at NOWRA, at the Pumper Show, and at many state conferences. Our speaker has also developed safety-focused training resources specific to the on-site industry under both federal OSHA and Washington state grants. He is currently the executive director of Washington On-Site Sewage Association, and he has held that position for 16 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Mr. John Thomas.
All right, well, good morning. You know, our industry is a conglomerate of small businesses, and that presents for us some really unique challenges in how we approach our business, how we approach some of the things that the TOWA is doing for you in terms of their representation. And what I like to do is, when I gauge an organization's strength or capability, I try and think of what I call my 3 rules of life. And I think you're going to have an opportunity to participate or to go in and hear the board meeting today. And just something to give you a little bit to think about is rule number 1 is, what do we have to contribute as an organization, as a company, as a small business owner? Rule number 2 is, can we affect change? And when we think about this on an industry level, decentralized wastewater, by definition, decentralized, makes it a challenge for us to do some of those things. And how we interact with our legislators, how we interact with our regulators, and doing this on an individual basis is a challenge. And that's really the strength of organizations like ours in Washington and like yours here in Texas. And so rule number 3 is, will we be listened to? And as I was watching the introduction and just looking at who you guys are interacting with at the legislative level, and some of the rule makers and some of the change makers, you guys have got one of the, if not the strongest organization in the country. You've got a great show that you put on every year, and so I congratulate you on the work that you're doing here in Texas. And so when we look at these small businesses, some of the challenges that we have around these issues for safety, we're going to talk a little bit about this morning. Over the last few years, there were 3 areas of focus that WOSA has gotten grants from OSHA and from our Washington State L&I to focus in on that are specific to our industry. Worker exposure to pathogens in wastewater. That's another whole class that we do, but some of the things that were surprises out of that field study that we did, where we were actually taking samples out of wastewater tanks and sending them into the labs and hospitals to get them evaluated for what's in them. There were kind of the usual suspects, but there were a couple that were a surprise to us. One was we found viable MRSA samples that were fluid samples that we took out of a septic tank. And then, how many of you guys here are pumpers? Few? Yeah? But the aerosolization that we do just in pumping operations was pretty dramatic in terms of the bubble that is created around a pump truck when we're working. Confined space entry for on-site workers, there's just a few things that we do that are confined space entries. In Washington, we're allowed to do tank repairs, and so guys are going in and out of tanks to fix cracked tanks and rehab them, going into larger tanks where they're doing pump replacements and some of that kind of stuff. There's a whole set of rules and guidelines, really, about how you can do some of that stuff safely. And then what we're going to talk about today is excavation and trench safety for on-site. And this has been always an issue for construction and for trenching and excavation, but this program that we put together is a full-day class. You're going to get a little bit of a sampling of that today for excavation and trenching safety that affects our industry. It's going to be a little bit more specific to us. So, as small business owners, one of the challenges that we have is resources. If you're less than 10 employees, if you're less than 5 employees, it's just hard to get through the day, right? If you're out there and you're working all day long, then you come home, then you're doing a couple, 2-3 hours of paperwork, it's hard to think about how safety affects your business and what are the things that you need to do to make it happen. And so really what we're talking about is risk management. And when you think about risk management in your business, you're throwing it all out there on the line if you're a small business owner, and you're doing it every day. You have liability issues from installations, which affects the money side of your business. You have your banking and loans and everything else that you're putting out there to resource a business. You got to worry about cash flow, how much business you're doing, and kind of in today's economy, if you guys down here are anything like Washington, that also adds something to the dynamic. And so it starts with a workplace evaluation. And rule number 1 in risk management is if you mess with the bull, anybody? You get the horn, that's right. And a lot can go sideways in 8 seconds. And so what do you do? To deal with the risk, personal protective equipment is some of the things that kind of come up next, right? And so in this industry, what happens is we've got these hard hats and face masks, and now they've got body armor that they're putting on. But one of the issues with personal protective equipment is it fit for use? And so does it do the job that you want it to do? You take a look at all the risks that this rider's facing right here, and what's going to happen next? He's going to hit the ground, right? And so does any of the PPE he's wearing address his fall protection that is in his workplace? And so when we look at what the employer responsibilities are, we have the boss. And the boss has really got 3 things to do. And this is kind of my company safety policies that are made simple. 1, you got to protect the rider. Next, you got to protect your partner. And lastly, you got to protect yourself. So when we look at this in context to a little bit of our industry, this is an excavation and installation job that was being done up in Minnesota. And they're down in this hole. This is an excavation by definition. And they're installing this track. This company is a subcontractor to a prime that is doing a little bit larger project. And what I can tell you about this is the only requirements for the prime on this to his subcontractor is that all of his workers have to wear hard hats and they have to wear reflective clothing. Are they meeting the requirements of the general? Yes. But are they protecting each other? Are they covering their bases? But it's the same deal. Protect the operator, protect your partner, and protect yourself. So I just look at this picture and it kind of gives me the willies about really what is going to happen next, right? And it's just a challenge. So when you look at this, how do you start? How do you start your safety program within your company? Because if you guys have spent any time looking at the rules or any of that kind of the regulations that kind of govern what you have to do, it can be absolutely overwhelming for a small business. And so what I tell folks to do is take a look across your company and all the activities that you do and what's going to kill somebody. And that's a great place to start. And if you can minimize or begin to manage that kind of risk, then you're well on your way to starting the safety program within your own company. So there's a whole set of rules around excavation and trenching that OSHA has. And really, as I've worked with those rules and read them, and we've done training and talked to a lot of people over across the country, I've really kind of changed my perspective on what these rules are. They're more of a guideline. So when we think about some of this work that we do that is inherently unsafe, should we not do it? Well, there's a lot of work that goes on down here in Texas in the oil fields and in the oil industry. You think about what some of those guys do. There's just a lot of inherently dangerous work. Doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means that if you're going to do it, you got to be smart about it. And so last year, OSHA submitted for a grant application to build this excavation and trenching operation training resource that is specific to our industry. And what it looks at is this 29 CFR and these three elements of it and then subpart P appendices. I'm going to give you just a little bit of an introduction to that, and then in our follow-on session we're going to go into a little bit more detail and some case studies. The areas that are really pertinent under this training include definitions, which are pretty easy, and at the bottom you'll see their employer and employee responsibilities, and those are almost the outliers of what's going to happen next once you get your competent person responsibilities defined, you understand what the soil classification scheme is, and then you make decisions about your trench protective systems for shoring and sloping and shielding guidelines, and then your different systems, your different options that you have for protective systems. So what is OSHA? They're the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They are a federal level agency, and it was created back in the 70s because of an increase in the number of deaths. And so OSHA has got rules and regulations not only for construction, but they've got rules and regulations for really virtually all of the work activities that happen in the country. So is Texas an OSHA state? Short answer there is yes. The way they've got this set up in Washington, we are an L&I. We have the Department of Labor and Industries, and so we have adopted all of the OSHA rules across the board and incorporated them. But we have our own state agency that administers them in the state of Washington. There's a number of states across the country that do it that way. In Texas, you've just adopted the OSHA state, so you don't have an agency here in Texas. But you adopt but OSHA has oversight on the rules. And recently they just revised the subpart P excavations of the CFR to do three things. One is to make the standard easier to understand, permit the use of performance criteria, which gives you as a small business owner a few more options in how you want to approach this stuff, and provide employers when classifying soils and your selection of the protection methods that you use. Why do we care? Excavating is recognized as one of the most hazardous things that we do in the country. We're going to see just a short little bit of statistics on this. But how many of you guys are installers? Hope we get a lot of you guys raise your hand. So how many of you have been in an excavation and had a sidewall come in? Right? How many of you have been trapped by an excavation up to the knees, up to the waist? Anybody? Yeah? Anybody know someone who's been killed in an excavation? That's part of why we care. And when we look at some of the trenching and injuries and deaths, there are the red columns here are the trench-related fatalities, and the other column is the trench-related reported injuries. And the difference between these is somebody died and somebody almost died. And for me, that's what I call a near miss. And in safety management, if you've got a method of identifying how many times in your organization you're going into an excavation, how many times that you've had a collapse in the excavation, that begins to give you an idea about how you can be proactive about managing those exposures in your workforce with your crew. You can Google this kind of stuff all day long. We've had 2 deaths in Washington in the last year. There was another one in Oregon just last year. David Allen here was buried up to his neck and died. Recovery operations took hours. When you're thinking about that, when we talk about this in Washington, we work in a lot of remote areas, and so cell phone service isn't always available. And how many of you guys are firefighters? Volunteer firefighters? Not a ton of you, but when we talk about rescue operations and who are you going to call, so for you couple, 3 guys, who are you going to call when you have a trench cave in and you got a guy buried up to his shoulders? 911 is usually the answer, right? But 911, they've got their excavation and safety training and protection and everything else too. And if they come and they see that this is an unsafe excavation, the first thing they're going to do is stabilize it if they can. And it's not untypical, and if it's a volunteer fire department, it just takes time to get all these guys gathered up and headed somewhere. It's not uncommon for it to be a 4-hour operation. And if you're in that trench and you've got a couple hundred pounds of weight on your chest, this is more likely going to turn into a body recovery than it is a rescue. So when do these rules in trench and excavation safety take effect? When do you got to start doing something different when you're digging a hole? 4 feet, right. And so this is a friend of mine's story that we're going to hear. This is a video that we produced. Embedded in the video, we've got some actors that we pulled together and kind of did a little bit of a reenactment. But as you listen to this video, I want you to listen to his story about what he's saying. And I want you to think about what his thought process was as he went through his decision-making on this job. He's a business owner, he's a designer, he's an installer, and he's a board member for me on our board in Washington. Listen for some key words here.
I have been in the business for 35 years. Everything from the simplest residential construction stuff to some of the most difficult stuff. I specialized in very difficult residential construction lots. Real steep slopes, real muddy sites, real difficult jobs. We loved them.
All right, so we're doing the drip mount today, right?
Yep. I took the class and I'm ready to get hands-on.
All right. Well, let's just make sure that we're going to do it the right way. God, I remember when my dad was doing stuff like this, he would just cowboy it, right? And jump in like it was nothing.
No safety, no rules.
No.
I remember hearing a story about a guy who got pulled out by a garden hose.
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, so let's go through this and make sure we don't have anything like that happen. Okay. So, making sure we got our PPE, hearing equipment, hard hat, safety vest. My boots aren't on yet, but they're in the truck. Are yours out there?
Yeah, I already put them in.
Perfect, great. We already called before the dig for the location, but just make sure that we did that.
811, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
On the control site, just making sure to tape it off, no kids, no pets, nothing wandering in. Moving equipment, we just want to make sure nobody gets struck by or caught in between anything. And along the same lines with the traffic control, I don't think that we're going to need to do anything.
Already have the cones?
They're out there just in case we need
Okay.
it, yeah. And then just when we dig, watching out for power lines, which we do anyway.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Yep. So I think that's it. We're ready to go.
It's in your DNA. You're either a risk taker or you're not. You'll either do it or you don't. I had an incident November 23rd of 1999. I do remember that day. It was the day before Thanksgiving. It was a Wednesday. I was going to do a side sewer hookup. Not very deep, 6 feet, maybe 6.5. It was raining so hard that day, and my company had bid this job that I tried on 3 different occasions with talking with the contractor, trying to postpone doing the job that day and doing it after the Thanksgiving weekend or the following week. The soils on this job were not very conducive to working in the rain. And that's why I tried to get the contractor to let me postpone this. He was adamant that it needed to be done that day. I was doing this on a bid price, so the price is set. So I know that all the material that I dig out, I have to haul away and then import new material for backfill. And through a series of events, bad decisions, and just things that were unknown to me.
I sure do hope John got this dig right this time. That is not right.
Not at all. Look, it's not even level in these corners. This is all fill. I mean, this is gonna make the excavation even harder.
Hold on, let me give him a call. He's only 5 minutes away. I'll get him back there.
Yeah, he's gonna be pissed.
Boom. In 15 seconds, I am completely passed out, no more air, and that's it. Once I came back and I became conscious again, I'm still in the ditch. I was still in that ditch for 15, 30 minutes. From the time that I became conscious to the time that they actually got me out of the ditch. One of the things I will tell you is that I hurt so bad that it was really, really difficult for me to focus on other things other than just how bad I hurt. I had never, ever experienced anything as painful as that. It just, my whole body just ached, and I could barely breathe. As it turned out, I had a punctured lung. So I had broken ribs, cracked ribs, bruised ribs, punctured lung, actually deflated. Both lungs were deflated, but one lung was punctured. I forget, a bunch of internal other injuries. Pressure. I did this from pressure from the contractor. That's it. It absolutely, afterwards, made a huge difference in how I looked at jobs and did jobs. I never let anybody else ever pressure me again. I don't let people push me anymore. I know what my limits are, and I go to my limits. I don't go any farther.
So that's really a great story, and it was his lucky day, right? Because everything came together that he was hurt, and he was hurt pretty bad, and he recovered. Took him over a year, but he got out the other side. The challenge that I see as I hear these same kinds of stories when we do these trainings across the country and stuff, the stories that people share with me, is that most of them are foxhole conversions, right? And so he's a believer now. And so how do you get a company, and a company with a smaller workforce, that are risk takers, maybe bull riders, that risk is just part of what they do. It's part of what they like, or it's part of what they got to do to get the job done, to take a look at this stuff doing differently. And so how these standards are set up is pretty simple. There's 3 basic areas of it: the scope, application, and definitions. And this tells you, where it applies and how. It tells you it gives you kind of an orientation to the map, if you will. Definitions about what a trench is, what an excavation is. 4 feet, 5 feet, you got to do something different in terms of its protection. How do guys get in and out? It's really a guideline for how to do this job safely. The general requirement standard gets into a little bit more detail, and as you read it, any of you that stay for this second session, we're going to have a handout that has all this information for it. And as you read through it, there's parts of it that you do, There's parts of it that don't apply to what you're doing today, and you're able to kind of sort through all that. And the idea is to minimize the amount of work that you got to put into this, so it doesn't slow you down, doesn't cost you money necessarily, but you can still do the job safely. And then the 652 lays out what the requirements are for protective systems. And then they've got a bunch of appendixes that go along with this. Soil classification is an important one because how we look at soils for excavation and trench safety is very different for us in our industry for how we take a look at soils. For the most part, in our application, for on-site design, how do we look at soil applications? Vertical separation, application loading rate, drain field sizing, that kind of stuff. But this soil classification scheme is a little bit different because it comes from a civil engineering standpoint in terms of how the soils are going to act once you start digging on them, or once they're in place and the excavation's been open for a little while, if water's involved and some of that kind of stuff. Sloping and benching is an option. If your construction site allows you and has the room for you to take this kind of an approach, and depending on the depth of your excavation, then basically you're just moving more dirt. You don't have to buy or rent trench boxes. You don't have to worry about timber shoring. Aluminum hydraulic shoring gives you some options that is equipment that you can rent. There's alternatives to timber shoring, and then there's a flow chart in there that really actually lets you work through whatever your problem is that's being presented to you on your construction projects. But the best way to use this is just to remember two things. The standards go from very general to very specific in their application. You want to review the standards and apply them, but you want to use them to work through different and changing conditions in the work. You start out, it's a warm, sunny day. Temperature goes down, like, well, not so much this time of year here, but we hit 70 degrees yesterday, but it was 28 at night. Freeze-thaw cycles, right, and just being cold. And you can use those then to work through this. For us in our industry, the most common exposures that we have are excavations that are less than 20 feet deep. Utility work and then the side sewer work. And so that kind of narrows the focus of how we read through the rules and which parts of it that we pick out to apply to our business. But there's other contributing contributions that I guess I've seen over time about what some of the drivers are, and they're cultural, they're situational awareness, there's, and I say culture, I mean the company culture on safety. What's the attitude about safety in your company? And so think about how does a strong economy affect trench safety? For us in Washington, we've got an unemployment rate right now that is pretty low. It's at 4%, and most of the guys in our industry, particularly as we're building into the spring here, because our work volumes are starting to spool up, we're having a hard time finding people. You guys experiencing any of that down here at all? Yes? No? So what comes next is the demands on the small business owner with this lack of skilled workers is training programs. And how do you bring a guy into your company, get him up to speed so you can basically start making money with him? Or if he's coming into your company and you're working on multiple projects, you're trying to build up your workforce so you can get a guy running out there independently for you and running a project. Is he doing the job that you want him to do? Do you have a training plan within your company? A lot of companies that are the size of the companies in our industry basically have what I call a sit by Johnny training plan. And so, you know, you hire a guy, he goes through the interview process. Maybe he came from another industry or another competitor, but he knows how to operate a piece of equipment, or he knows how to operate a pump truck, but he's really got the attitude and the training and the experience from some other company. And so as an employer, you got to kind of think through, or at least recognize what those things mean, is whether you're importing bad work habits from another employer into your company, and then how do you train around some of that kind of stuff. And then this is the situational awareness thing where there's just this general lack of understanding of what the exposures are in some of these different work settings. Company cultures that can't recognize, and some of this stuff is built in, is what I call positive reinforcement for negative behaviors. So when you think about what that means, is that you stick a screwdriver in a control panel and nothing bad happens. Or you're working in, you're going inside of a septic tank to mud it up on a crack that you're doing in there and nothing bad happens. And the more often that you do that and nothing bad happens, you reinforce that behavior. But sometimes that kind of stuff leaks back up to the company leadership that rationalizes, and this acceptable business risk is a statement that I got from one of our larger companies in Washington. They do pumping, they do installation, they do maintenance and monitoring. And this is an example of one of his jobs.
My displacement was making the tank flood. Tommy, you need a screwdriver. We gotta clean this
That's
up.
not a first aid or a float jacket he's wearing there.
Baptism. Hey, is someone hang on to this?
Pretty cool, huh? So this is a, from a rule standpoint, this is a uncontrolled confined space entry. A couple of things that make this a little bit worse for me is that this was a ocean beach job that they were doing this installation on, and somehow in the workflow process they set this tank. They had to get there on an incoming tide, so they had time to work. They got to this part of the job and they realized when they loaded up the tank and stuff, somebody hadn't put the UV light assembly inside the tank when it was on dry ground. And so the supervisor, who wouldn't make his workers do anything that he wouldn't do, dove into the tank. This is seawater, right? It's 50 degrees, maybe 48 degrees, and he's got about 45 minutes to get this done before the incoming tide comes up over the top of that tank. So my question to the business owner was, oh, and then they posted this on their website page. How cool was that, right? And so my question to the business owner was, after you became aware of this, what did you do next? Did you fire the guy? Did you give him a couple days off with pay to think about what he's done? Because they have a confined space entry protocol that was completely abandoned because of the timeline that they were on with this tide coming in. Or did you pat him on the back and say, good job, I appreciate your initiative in getting this work done today, right? So the business owner's got three options there. For them, this is acceptable business risk, right? Particularly when it's somebody else that's there. So then they rang the bell, and they got lucky on a big job. And so they got 2,100 feet of sewer pipe to put in, and they really hadn't done a job this big. You can see from the side wall excavation, the collapse, and if you've done much of this work, you can recognize some of the contributors to that. You know, the surge loading of the waste pile too close to the edge, some of that kind of stuff. But they hired this guy right here from another company because he had experience with this. He was their competent person on the site. And so one of the key things, we showed up on this job and spent a couple of hours there, was that how does the guy get in and out of the hole? And under the rule says you got to have a ladder from him 25 feet in either direction to get out. Where's the ladder in the picture? Can you see it? It's sitting over here, right? So they got a ladder, but it isn't really doing them a lot of good, right? So in this company, really, the attitude of the culture, of the safety culture of the company, is what you permit, you promote. And so, again, as you think about how you approach safety in your company, this is really a key element of what you want to think about. How many of you guys have been here? I guess the first question is, how do you think he got in that hole? Right? And how do you think he's going to get out? Right, same thing. So we had three big things that as we've worked through these different safety programs that we've developed in our industry, and that there are companies that have programs in place. There are companies that have some programs in place, but they aren't really working the way the owner thinks they are, or there's no programs in place at all. And lastly, that worker situational awareness is low. And so when you start thinking about putting in place or revisiting your safety program stuff, these are just, there's three core areas here that you can address. If you've got your program in place, are there any weaknesses in it? And if your worker situational awareness is low, you know, is there toolbox talks and pickup safety talks when you're out on the job that morning? We're going to look at something that's specific that we're going to need to address. For the excavation and trenching safety program, one of really the keys to introducing a successful program really hinges around the competent person. And in the rule, it outlines a lot of what those responsibilities are. And, but basically, it kind of drills down to these 5 elements. Has someone been assigned responsibility on the site to be the designated competent person? So whether it's you as the business owner, or if you're not on site, you've got your lead guy, whoever that person is, he understands what the rule is. He can identify the soils. He can identify the soils in changing conditions like weather, rain, flooding, any of that kind of stuff. And he's allowed to make decisions. And that last element of this is probably one of the most important, is what you're giving him authority to do is shut down the job, right? Because something has changed or he needs to do something, different. So, like I said, our soil classification for excavations is not normally how we think about on-site. And so we're going to get into a little bit more detail on that in our follow-on session about the 3 types of soils that we have under the rule. So as we take a look at really what's next, we're going to, in this next session, we're going to go a little bit more in depth, look at some of the rule in detail and some case studies, and focus this afternoon then on the OSHA Focus 4, where we'll continue on some additional topics around this safety and everything in here. And what really we want to try and get you to work at is, or to at least think about, is using proactive versus reactive approaches to developing your program. And really what that means is when you have an accident and or there's an investigation, whether it's you do an internal review or OSHA comes in and does all of their accident investigation, that's a reactive, and they're going to tell you, or you're going to come up with a punch list of how you should have done it differently, what rules you violated, what you should have had done in place for training, for personal protective equipment. And one of the case studies that we'll do this afternoon is look at a fatality that happened, and the company was cited for the fatality. I think the total dollar amount was $127,000 for a small business. Pretty big chunk of change to bite off. But they started with the fatality, and then they ended up with fire extinguishers that weren't currently inspected. So it's soup to nuts when they come in to do their investigation when something happens. But if you can be proactive about it and get on the front end of that, and what I said earlier, identify as a starting point, what is it that we do as a company that's going to kill somebody, and start there. That's going to be your best approach to working up your safety program. So I just, I'm always astounded when I look on the internet and look at different jobs and how people approach them. And as much as anything, what I'll leave you with today before we break is that your guys that are working out in the field, you can promote safety, you can tell them about safety, you can give them the gear for safety, but once they're left on their own out there, they're going to figure out a way to do the job. I don't want to be that guy, but anyways. So anyways, we're out a little bit early, so I'll invite you to go to the exhibit hall and spend some time with there. I understand that there are over 80 exhibitors that are there. And you guys have got a good program going on today, and then we'll hopefully see you, a few of you anyway, a little bit later back in our class here. So thank you.